welcome to the Global Mindset University. I'm your host, Mohammed Rashid Kamal. Today, I am here with a new episode with the ServiceNow scripted REST API. I'm Mohammed Kamal. Over here, what I can show you right here is that is my app, the connected app that I presented in the Hackathon 2020, the ServiceNow Digital Experience Hackathon, which is basically that app was mainly connecting the health professionals with the patients. I have an episode video on that one on the Global Mindset University. Feel free to go ahead and get that video from there. But on today's episode, I will go ahead and start discussing about the scripted REST API. So it has two parts. First, I have a couple of discussion point to discuss with you guys, and the next part is the demo part. So on the demo part, I will go ahead and show you what it looks like a scripted REST API, and we can also write a scripted REST API in the ServiceNow instance. Great. So a scripted REST API, it's a feature that allow application developers to build a custom web service API. So that is the purpose of scripted REST API. It will help to develop custom web service API. So you can, what is API? Some of you might ask what API is. So API, let's say that you are requesting an information. Think about this. You go ahead and go to a cafeteria. In the cafeteria, you might request a coffee, and coffee has a certain way to be made. And the one who's going to make the coffee have to go through a certain process and make that coffee for you. So after that, that coffee will be delivered to you. So the one who's going to make that coffee for you is the server. So that's the one is going to process that one and deliver it to you. The same thing like that in the scripted API. So the API, so we have the server that communicate with the server and get the data for us. So we can go ahead and see what the request and the response it looks like. But in general, scripted REST API in ServiceNow generally help you to manage your request and the response, because in ServiceNow we have everything is in table, right? In data table. So sometimes you may need to communicate with an instance which is outside your instance, from outside your instance, or you may want to communicate one table to the other table. So with that, you will need a scripted REST API, and you can manage that the request and the response. The third important thing here is you can define the service endpoint and the query parameters as well in your scripted REST API. So generally it follow a REST architecture, but what you can customize to your different conventions. So you can define the scripted REST API using the script REST service, where you can have on your later on I'm gonna go ahead and show you where you can find those information in the ServiceNow instance. But in general, this instance has a couple of the script REST API URL have format. So I'll show you what that format looks like. So the first and basic and most important is the instance. So the instance information, so that the instance is your instance.service-now.com. That is your instance, and that's the format you need to follow. So you'll have https :/ the instance. So that's the instance you will have. And with that, once you have that instance, there is the namespace. So the namespace is basically, it's the web service in the global scope. The namespace is give you in the global scope. The namespace is the value of the property. Let's say if you have a global scope, that's what you have, the property you have in that instance. So that's the namespace. For the web service in the scoped application, the namespace is the scope name. Basically, you have two things here in ServiceNow. There's a global scope, and then you have the global application, and you have the scoped app. If you are creating the scripted REST API in a scoped application, so and then if you have so in the namespace, you will use the scoped application. And if you are using the global, that the value of the property in the global scope is the one that you're going to use. There is also version. So the version, this is optional actually. So the version of the endpoint to access, if the API use the version, it can be like v1, v2. You can use different version, but that is optional. You can access the default version of the versioned API by specifying the value without the version number. That's optional literally, but you can have different version for that. And another important thing is the API ID. This is the value of the API ID. So the field on the scripted REST service form. So by default, this value is based on the service name. Whatever service name you have, that the API name, you can specify that one array. And the relative path is the relative path. You basically define the resource in the scripted REST service form. You specify the relative resource path that allow you to have multiple resources in the same HTTP method. Things like GET, the GET method, right? In one web service, for example, the resource may modify the path ID when the web service has only one GET resource. When the web service has a different resource for requesting users and messages. So that is the important principles when you talk about the scripted REST API URI. So that's the things we need to follow. And another important piece here, when you talk about the scripted REST API, is the role. What role you require. So in general, to work on with the scripted REST API, one must have a web service administration access, which is the web service admin role. If you have that, you have the role to work on. But if you don't have, you cannot be able to work on the scripted REST API. Users with this role, they can read, they can create, modify, they can delete the scripted REST API and the web service resource as well. We will see those in detail when I go ahead and take you to the demo session, which is coming up in a few minutes. So one thing to remember here is the role, there is no role required to access the scripted REST API endpoint. So the endpoint, you don't need to have a role to access it. But when it comes to the security, you can configure your scripted REST API with necessary level of security. Think like your table, right? Your table has a different kind of security you can apply. Read, write, delete, right? So the same thing, you can apply different security. From the public API, you go to the endpoints that don't require any security to a higher security API or endpoint that require users authentication with a tight access control to all resource. That's up to you. So you can apply that a higher security, or you can let it in a public API. So that's up to you, up to the developer, and up to the requirements. And based on that, you can go ahead and configure your REST API. So it depends on the requirement what you are working on. So by default, the scripted REST API contains the ACL, which is the access control that prohibit the users from an external role from making any request to the API. The role what we call SN external is any users having a role, an external role, they cannot be able to. So that's by default, that's prevented by that. So when defining the scripted REST API ACL, which is the access control, you must have typed the value, which is the REST endpoint. The REST endpoint. Yeah, so that's how we can go ahead and do the scripted REST API. But now I will go ahead and take you to the backend and show you some of the important features on the scripted REST API. So let's go ahead and do some demo here. I'll take you here with my instance, with my developer instance. That's my developer instance. here with my developer instance, I've just write here the scripted REST API, scripted REST. So that is the scripted REST API. Now, think about this. In this scripted REST API, this is an example of scripted REST API. I'm going to take you back to the scripted REST API. If you want to create a new one, you can go ahead and start creating a new one. There are almost 65 or a little more than that REST APIs, scripted REST APIs that are out of the box there. So you can go ahead and look at those. One, for example, the contextual search is for in the customer service CXS. Now, this scripted REST API on over here, this script, as you can see right here, this record is in the global application. So you need to be on the scope where that scripted REST API is written. Now it is in the global application, but I am not on the global. But to access it, let's go ahead and change our scope to the global application. And what this give you is that this item is a read-only mode. That means this is out of the box from the ServiceNow. You cannot make edit on this one. You can, if you want to make a change, you can insert and stay, so you can edit the name, but you cannot make any change on this one. So let's go ahead and see. It has a name, so where you can give it the name of the scripted REST API and the API ID. What that API ID is, for example, on this one is CXS, which is the customer service. That's the API ID we have. Earlier we have seen what the scripted REST API endpoint looks like, the URL looks like. So that's the API ID you need it. And it's active, and its protection policy is read only. That's what ServiceNow apply on it. And the application scope is in global. And API namespace is now. So it means now platform. And the base API path is /API /now/CXS. So you gotta follow that API path. And the first important thing here is the security. So by default, may be selected to apply to all resource, but individual resource can override this setting. The default ACRs are enhanced for the resource when the resource requires authentication and requires ACL authorization. Like I said earlier, you can develop a scripted REST API, an API that can be accessed by the public, or something that have high security that require authentication and authorization. So authentication is your user, and if you logged in, and then authorization, you need to have the authorization to access those pointers. When it comes to the content navigation, there is a way you can override supported request, the default support request format, that's application and JSON. So that's what we have here, the application / JSON format. All right, let's go ahead and see a couple of things. Here we have a documentation. You can click here and you can have the REST API Explorer documentation. If you want to look at those information, you can get from there. Under related links, we have the Explore REST API. If you'd like to explore, you can check it here with this link and the API analysis. So another important thing is the resource we have here. Under resource, you'll have different HTTP methods. One is, for example, the action handler. It is a post. That's the relative path you have, and that's the resource path, and that's the API version. The version, like I said, is not mandatory, but you can apply it if you would like, and it's active, so still you can use it. And there's a feedback, which is a post again. HTTP method is a post. And we also have feedback /link, that's the name, and it's also a post. So this is the resource. That's the most important part of the scripted REST API. We also have the request header, but in this case we don't have. And we also have the query parameters. Whatever query parameters you can apply, you can write them here. Great. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and create a new scripted REST API here. Let's give it a name. So what I would say here, I'll go ahead and test this one. This is test script. I'm gonna go ahead and give it a name. That is the test script. Okay, test scripted API. I'm gonna go ahead and save. That's the name. The API ID will be automatically applied. And now if I go ahead and save this one, I'll have that. Great. Now it is active. There's the protection, doesn't have any protection policy, but this is under global. Get it from the global scope right there. That's the API name, and the base API. That's what I have. API SN test underscore scripted underscore API. Get it from the API ID. So that's the URL, how it's going to be. That's the default ACL. If you'd like to apply, I'm gonna go ahead and apply that if I would like to have.